The last reader, the desert didn't forgive mistakes. That was the first thing you learned at Sierra Run Testing Facility carved into the Nevada hardpan, 60 miles from anything that resembled civilization. The heat came at you sideways here. Not the honest heat of summer that you could drink water against and shade yourself from. This was a different animal entirely. It bent light. It twisted air into shapes that had no business existing. It took a perfectly calibrated piece of machinery worth more than most men earned in a decade and turned that machinery into a very expensive paperweight. Sergeant Doyle knew this. He had known it for 23 years of service, 15 of them in units that didn't appear on any public roster. He had shot in conditions that would make most men's hands shake just hearing about them. Wind over 40 knots, temperatures that cracked metal, darkness so complete you felt the rifle breathe rather than saw it. He was the best shooter at this facility. He had missed 5 times in a row. The fifth shot still hung in the air when the range computer delivered its verdict in cold green text across the monitor. Target lost. Atmospheric compensation failure. Nobody spoke. The technical team stood around their equipment like men at a funeral, heads down, eyes avoiding each other. Captain Braddock stood slightly apart, arms crossed, jaw set, watching Doyle's back. Dr. Vance, the civilian contractor who had spent 2 years and $40 million developing the targeting system, now displayed on that monitor, stared at the readout with the expression of a man watching his house burn down in slow motion. And off to the right, standing exactly where she had been told to stand, holding a clipboard she hadn't been asked to use, a 24-year-old woman from Montana named Jess Calloway, watched all of it. She had been watching the wind, not the instrument readings, not the digital displays, not the 3 separate anemometers positioned at intervals across the range. She had been watching the way heat rose from the valley floor in thin, transparent curtains, bending light above the earth in patterns that the sensors couldn't measure because the sensors didn't know those patterns existed. Her father had showed her what to look for. He had been showing her since she was 9 years old. The mountains above Billings did not offer comfort in October. Cal Calloway had understood this completely, and he communicated it to his daughter through the simplest possible method, taking her up into those mountains before dawn in temperatures that hovered around 20 degrees, handing her a rifle that weighed nearly as much as she did, and saying nothing for 45 minutes while they waited for the light. She had been furious at first. 9 years old, wool socks that didn't reach her knees, breath coming in clouds that dissolved into the dark. Her father sat beside her on a granite shelf, like a man carved from the same stone, patient, in the way that only former military men in old mountains managed to be patient. Then the light came, slowly, the way real things happen. In that light across a valley 300 yards wide, she saw what he had brought her to see. The air moved differently at different heights. Not randomly, not chaotically. It moved in layers, each layer traveling at its own speed, its own direction, influenced by the temperature of the rock beneath it and the shape of the ridge above it. If you stared at the valley long enough, if you let your eyes unfocus slightly and stopped trying to see individual objects and started trying to see movement itself, you could read those layers the way you read words on a page. Her father put his hand on her shoulder. He didn't point. He didn't instruct. He waited until she turned to look at him, and then he said the one thing she would carry for the rest of her life. Machines read numbers. Eyes read truth. She hit the target that morning. 300 yards. Clean through the vital zone. Her father nodded once, stood, and began walking back down toward the truck without ceremony because celebration wasn't the point. He wanted her to understand that from the beginning. The point was seeing clearly. Cal Calloway had served 2 tours with Marine Recon, seen things he never described in detail, come home with a body that worked in a mind shaped by the geography of violence from the inside. He didn't discuss what he had done overseas. What he talked about was technique, patience, the mechanics of air and light and distance. He taught Jess to shoot the way some fathers taught children to swim, not as a sport, not as a hobby, but as something fundamental you needed because the world was larger and less forgiving than most people admitted. By 12, she could read wind patterns in 3 valleys she knew by name. By 15, she held 2 junior records at the county range. By 17, she was declining invitations to travel for competition because competition didn't interest her. She wasn't trying to beat anyone. She was trying to see clearly. Her father died in the spring of her 21st year. Heart failure, the kind that arrives without warning or negotiation. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a county map he had been studying for no particular reason, and then he wasn't sitting anywhere anymore. She didn't cry at the funeral. She cried 3 weeks later, alone in the field behind their property, facing the grass for a long time without sound. Because he had taught her that grief was private, that it belonged to you, that showing it to the world was a form of trespass. Then she stood up, walked back to the house, looked at his rifles in the cabinet by the door. 6 months later, she enlisted. The recruiter in Billings looked at her preliminary test scores with the expression of a man whose math kept producing an answer he didn't trust. He went through the numbers twice. Then he looked up. He asked if she had done this before. She said she had been taught right. He made 3 phone calls before she left his office, 3 more than he made for most recruits. And his voice on those calls was careful and quiet, the voice of a man who had found something he didn't want to drop. Basic training was not difficult for her, not physically, not technically. The difficulty was patience, not the patience of waiting, which she had learned on granite shelves before dawn, but the patience of slowing herself down to match a system that wasn't designed for people who already knew most of what it was teaching. She didn't complain. She understood that systems had purposes larger than any individual, and she respected systems even when they bored her. What eventually got her attention was a flag in her personnel file. She wouldn't see it or know it existed for months, but someone in an office had looked at her marksmanship scores, run them against a database of existing records, run them again because the comparison didn't make sense, and written 2 words in the notes section: evaluate further. Those words were the reason she stood at Sierra Run on a Tuesday in late October, holding a clipboard she hadn't been asked to use, watching Doyle fail to hit a target at 2,950 meters, while $40 million of computerized assistance told him the shot was possible. The XM-31 long reach was objectively a technological achievement. This was Dr. Vance's phrase, delivered that morning during the pre-test briefing with the subdued pride of a man watching years of work finally emerge into the world. The rifle itself was an evolution of existing platforms. What was genuinely new was the integrated targeting system, a processor drawing data from atmospheric sensors across the range, combining it with ballistic modeling, refined over thousands of test rounds, providing real-time compensation adjustments that in theory eliminated the need for a shooter to manually calculate wind correction. In theory, Vance had not spent enough time in Montana valleys. Jess had understood the core problem within the first 20 minutes of watching the setup. The sensors were accurate. The processor was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. But the data being collected didn't account for something she had watched her father explain with a stick in the dirt when she was 11. Thermal layering. In a valley like this one, cut into desert between ridges, absorbing heat at different rates, the air didn't move in a direction. It moved in layers, each layer a different temperature, each differential creating a microcurrent pushing against its neighbor. The effect on a bullet traveling through hundreds of meters of these stacked currents was cumulative and directional, a gentle but persistent deflection that no single-point measurement could capture. The sensors read one layer at a time. The truth was in all of them simultaneously. She saw it in the heat shimmer above the valley floor, in the way dust lifted and dispersed at different intervals along the range. She had been watching it since dawn, mapping it in her head the way her father taught her, building a picture of the air that was invisible to instruments but completely legible to trained eyes. She said nothing. She had been told to hold the clipboard and observe. Sergeant Doyle was not a small man, and he was not a quiet one. He carried 15 years of special operations experience, the way some men carried hardware, always present, always accessible, displayed without being explicitly shown. He had looked at Jess once when she arrived, a 2-second assessment that covered the complete geography of his opinion. She was young, she was not special operations. She was here to observe from a polite distance. He communicated all of this without speaking, then turned his attention back to the range, and she had not existed for him again until she was useful as something to hand equipment to. Hold this. Don't touch the scope. She took the rifle with both hands, balanced it properly, and stood where she was told. The morning progressed. The system performed well inside 1,500 meters. At 2,000, it began showing stress. Small inconsistencies, Vance noted carefully, and Doyle absorbed without visible concern. At 2,500, the inconsistencies became patterns. At 2,950 meters, the target remained untouched after 5 shots from one of the finest marksmen currently active in the United States Army. Doyle set the rifle down after the 5th miss with the deliberate care of a man controlling something that wants very much to become uncontrolled. He turned to face the technical team with an expression stripped of everything except the essential engineering of the problem. The scope needs manual override, he said. The system is fighting itself. Vance pulled up the readout data. The system is operating within parameters. Environmental factors at this range are at the edge of compensation capacity. There it was, the edge of compensation capacity. which meant the system had been designed for conditions this valley was currently exceeding, which meant every adjustment the processor made was based on an incomplete atmospheric model, and every shot was deflected in a direction the math said was impossible and the air said was inevitable. She looked down at her clipboard, then back at the valley. The thermal shimmer above the floor had shifted in the last hour. The layers were tightening. The window of accurate fire was not getting larger. She said nothing. The argument between Doyle and Vance was professional on the surface and not professional underneath the disagreement of men with competing investments in an outcome. Vance wanted the system to be the problem so the system could be fixed. Doyle wanted the shooter to be the variable so a better shooter could succeed where he had not. Braddock stood apart and watched both of them with the patience of a man who had heard this argument before in other rooms about other equipment and knew how it ended. It ended with someone looking for a different variable. His eyes moved to Jess. She was not watching the argument. She was watching the range. Her head was tilted very slightly, the way a bird tilts its head when it hears something others miss. Her eyes weren't focused on any specific point. They were taking in the whole valley simultaneously. Braddock was 52 years old. In 30 years, he had seen technically perfect shooters who produced technically perfect results and nothing else. He had seen instinctive shooters who could hit a moving target in bad light, but fell apart when conditions changed. He had seen maybe 3 times in his entire career something different from both a shooter doing something that looked from the outside like intuition, but was actually a different kind of calculation, one that bypassed language and lived entirely in the body. He excused himself quietly, walked to the equipment table, opened his briefing folder to the personnel summary accompanying Jess's assignment. He read for 2 minutes. Then he stood still, looking at nothing in particular. The name on the file was Calloway. The personnel notes buried 3 pages enlisted next of kin as part of the standard form. Father Corporal Calvin James Calloway, USMC retired. Deceased, Cal Calloway. Braddock had heard that name spoken in tones reserved for landmarks and weather events. Things larger than individual people, things that had become part of the landscape of shared experience. He had heard it from men in units that didn't appear on public rosters, spoken carefully with the particular weight soldiers gave to names they had reason to remember. He looked across the range at the young woman holding a clipboard. He closed the folder. He said nothing to anyone. She had told no one. She was here as herself, and he was going to make sure she had the chance to stay that way, at least until it no longer mattered. The confrontation arrived the way confrontations did in professional environments, not as an explosion, but as accumulation. A word, a look, a pause lasting 1 second too long. Doyle had taken the rifle back from Jess to adjust the scope, then handed it back while he and Vance argued about elevation compensation. She stood holding it as she had been asked to, feeling its balance settle into her hands, with a familiarity built from 1,000 hours of handling weapons. Her fingers rested near the adjustment dial. Not on it, near it. She noticed something in the tactile feedback. The scope had been dialed to a setting working against the elevation program, creating competing correction values that canceled each other out at extreme range. Doyle looked over and saw her hand position. He was not subtle about his assessment of her presence, her qualifications, or her right to have opinions about a weapons system she had been brought here to observe from a polite distance. He spoke with the precision of a man who was angry but controlled, which made it worse. No ambiguity in what he said, no deniability in the emotion behind it. Braddock cut it short. His voice was quiet and final. The voice of someone who had decided the conversation was over and was simply communicating that decision. The group returned to work. Jess absorbed the silence that followed. Her eyes tracked the target 2,950 meters away, shimmering in the thermal distortion above the valley floor. She had already done the calculation 3 times. Braddock made the call because the alternative was documenting a test failure, and because 30 years of experience told him some variables couldn't be measured with instruments. He made it quietly without ceremony, while Doyle reviewed shot data with Vance 20 feet away. One shot he said to Jess, no preamble, no qualification. A simple operational decision stated cleanly. She nodded once. Doyle heard it. His reaction moved through 3 stages: disbelief, contempt, and the specific variety of anger belonging to people who believe the rules are being bent in directions they shouldn't bend. He said something that made 2 technicians look away. Braddock didn't respond. He had already turned toward the firing position. Jess walked to the rifle. She did not lie down behind it immediately. This was the thing certain people would remember afterward, and describe in every retelling the way she stood behind the weapon for nearly 90 seconds, completely still watching the valley with the same intensity she had held all morning. Nobody spoke. The silence had texture, the kind that forms around moments before they become what they're going to become. She reached down and made 3 precise adjustments to the scope. Then she reached to the control panel integrated into the rifle's stock and disabled the atmospheric compensation system entirely. Not reduced it, not modified it, turned it off and returned control to the shooter. Someone exhaled behind her. She lay down. The world became simple. This was the part she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't stood in a similar place, the way everything that wasn't the shot receded to a distance where it couldn't affect anything. Not Doyle, not the technical team, not the weight of the name she carried and hadn't told anyone she was carrying. Not the 3 years since she had knelt in a field behind her house and cried without sound into cold grass. Just her. The rifle. 2,950 meters of Nevada desert air, and the truth written in it that she had been reading since dawn. She found the layers, mapped them one final time, felt the moment when they aligned a window lasting approximately 4 seconds before the thermal cycling shifted the pattern again. She inhaled, let half of it go, squeezed. The rifle's report crossed the range and returned as echo. 3 seconds of nothing. Then the range computer spoke. Target hit. Distance confirmed. 2,950 meters. First round. No computer assistance. Vance read the numbers aloud, then read them again. His voice on the second pass was lower, slower, as though the information needed to be handled carefully. Nobody cheered. Nobody moved. Jess safed the weapon and stood up. Her expression was the expression of someone who has completed a task that required care, not the expression of someone who has won something. Those were different things, and she was old enough to know the difference. Braddock met her eyes across 10 feet of desert. He said nothing, but something passed between them in that look, a recognition, a transfer of information that required no language. He knew what she came from. He knew what she was capable of. And he had chosen this morning to let her be here as herself, to let the shot speak before the name behind it spoke, to give her the one thing harder to earn than any record, a beginning that belonged to her alone. Doyle stood at the edge of the group rifle on the equipment table behind him. His face had gone through its changes and arrived somewhere quiet and expressionless, the way a landscape looks after a storm has passed, stripped, rearranged, not yet accounted for. Vance was already on the radio. The desert held the echo a moment longer, then let it go. The story arrived at Fort Benning before Jess did. This was the nature of military installations, closed systems that amplified information the way canyons amplified sound, bouncing it off walls until the original signal was almost unrecognizable. By the time her transport touched down at Lawson Army Airfield on a gray Thursday morning, the version circulating through the Army Marksmanship Unit compound had acquired details the original event didn't possess and shed details it did. Some versions had her disabling the computer system dramatically, like a technician pulling a fuse. One version, which she heard only indirectly, suggested that Braddock had arranged the demonstration in advance, that the whole sequence had been theater rather than test, a staged exhibition designed to satisfy a requirement in someone's diversity reporting matrix. That version was the one that followed her through the gates. She could feel it in the quality of the attention she received when she checked in, signed her forms, and was shown to her quarters. Not hostility, not warmth. Something suspended and watchful, the attention of people who had heard an extraordinary claim and were waiting to see the claimant in person before deciding how much of it to believe. 20 candidates had arrived for the selection course. 3 spots were available. Everyone present understood the arithmetic. Jess had won a competition at Sierra Run she hadn't been invited to enter. Here she was entering a competition she hadn't won yet against people who had spent years preparing for exactly this. She unpacked her kit, made her bunk, and went to find the range. Sergeant Nash was already there. He was lying behind a rifle at the far end of the long-range bay, working a series of practice shots at 800 meters with the methodical patience of someone for whom an activity has stopped being an activity and become a form of thinking. She watched from 50 feet back, not announcing herself, taking in his technique, the way her father had taught her to study any craft, starting with what was invisible, the things that happened before the mechanics, the stillness in the breath, and the quality of attention that preceded good work. He was excellent, not the excellence of natural talent, which has a looseness suggesting ease. This was the excellence of accumulated labor, a man who had done this 10,000 times and understood every dimension of the doing. Nothing wasted in him. He finished his series, safed the weapon, sat up. He looked directly at her. He had known she was there. She walked forward, introduced herself, name and rank, nothing else. He studied her within the measuring quiet of someone who read people the way she read air. Not aggressively, with genuine assessment, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He didn't offer his hand. He said he had heard about the shot at Sierra Run. She said yes. He asked if she had long-range competition experience. She said no. He looked at her a moment longer, then stood, gathered his equipment, and walked past her toward the equipment room without further comment. Not rudely, not warmly. With the economy of a man who had decided something and had no reason to explain his reasoning. She stood at the range alone and understood from what she could observe, rather than what she had been told, that she had been assessed and that the verdict was not yet in. The qualification course ran 5 days. Day 1 was fundamental standard marksmanship to 1,000 meters, establishing baseline rather than ceiling. Jess placed in the top 3, without difficulty, her natural precision intact. Day 2 was different. The course designers understood something most shooting tests didn't: measure the difference between a shooter in a controlled environment and a shooter under compounding physical and cognitive stress. Day 2 began at 0430 with a 6-mile run in full kit, followed by a decision-making exercise requiring candidates to process tactical information while heart rates were still elevated, followed by a shooting sequence in which targets appeared and disappeared on unpredictable timers. Jess placed 7th. She knew exactly what had happened. She had the physical conditioning. She had the mechanics. What she lacked was the practiced automation of the tactical sequence, the trained efficiency allowing a soldier to perform cognitive tasks while the body was still recovering from exertion. That automation required specific repetitions she hadn't accumulated. That evening, she found empty space in the training bay and ran the sequence alone for 2 hours. Not because she had been told to, because it was the gap, and gaps needed filling. Nash came in at the 2nd hour. He watched her run the sequence 3 times without speaking. Then he said, "Your decision points are too wide. You're thinking when you should be executing." He walked to the equipment rack, selected a secondary training weapon, took position beside her. He ran the sequence once, slowly narrating each decision point in the flat tone of an instructor who had long since stopped caring whether the student was impressed and was only interested in whether they understood. She watched, then ran it herself. He said nothing afterward. He put the training weapon back and left. But he came back the following evening and the one after that. They didn't discuss Sierra Run. They didn't discuss anything that wasn't the work directly in front of them. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was 2 people who took craft seriously enough to set other things aside. On day 3, something shifted among the candidates. The early sessions had maintained surface cordiality because nobody yet knew who was worth competing against. By day 3, the numbers had established a hierarchy, and the hierarchy created different conditions. The men struggling began sharing information and observations. The men at the top began watching each other more carefully. Jess was in the upper third. She was the only woman. Neither fact was as significant as what had begun replacing them in the minds of the men around her, the more pressing fact that she was competition in a course with 3 spots and 20 candidates. Nobody said anything directly. That wasn't how it worked. But the quality of the room changed, and she recognized what the change meant. She was beginning to be taken seriously. On the afternoon of day 3, Nash found her after the final session. He sat beside her without invitation or preamble, the way people sit when they have decided to say something and want to say it before they change their mind. He put his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. He said he knew who her father was. She didn't answer immediately. She had felt it approaching since arriving, not as something feared exactly, but as something inevitable. A reckoning she had postponed by not announcing it in a conversation the world was going to have, whether she initiated it or not. She said yes. He said he had spent years researching an operation that had gone wrong in ways that still troubled him. He had spoken with men who were there, men who gave him pieces of it. When those pieces assembled, one name appeared consistently at a decision point, with consequences Nash had spent a long time trying to understand. He said her father's name. The room had the quality of rooms holding difficult things, ordinary in dimension, larger in atmosphere. Jess kept her hands flat on the bench and looked at a point in the middle distance, and felt the specific stillness belonging to moments when the thing you half expected arrives and turns out heavier than the half expectation had suggested. She asked what he meant. He told her carefully without embellishment, not as accusation, as a fact he had carried and was setting down in front of her because he thought she deserved to know it existed, even if neither of them yet understood its full shape. A field decision, a sequence of events, an outcome that had cost people Nash had known. Cal Calloway's name in the record. Her father had never spoken of it. Not once in all the years she had listened to him talk about craft and patience and the ethics of the shot. She sat with this for a long time. Nash didn't fill the silence. He waited, which was its own form of respect. She said she didn't have an answer for him, that she had known her father as one thing, and was now being asked to hold the possibility he was also something else, and she didn't yet know if those two things could exist in the same space. Nash looked at her and said, "Most people can't hold that question open. They close it fast one way or the other." He stood and left. She stayed at the bench another hour holding the question open because her father had taught her that honest observation required sitting with what you couldn't yet explain rather than filling the gap with something comfortable. It was the hardest application of his teaching she had yet attempted. She passed the qualification course in the top 3. Not cleanly, not with the effortless margin that talent was supposed to produce. On day 4, she placed 3rd in the combat stress sequence. On day 5, extreme long range, under simulated field conditions, 5 shots from an unstable position after physical exertion. 1 minute total, she placed 1st. Nash placed 2nd. He offered no congratulations immediately. The following morning, briefly before the first brief of the day, he said she had earned it. She said she still had work on the tactical sequences. He said yes. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. He said most people would have said thank you and left it there. She said her father hadn't raised someone who left things there. Something settled between them. Not the resolution of what he had told her about the operation that remained open and unresolved, still heavy in the air between them. Something else. A mutual recognition of the kind formed between people who have been honest with each other about difficult things and not broken under the honesty. She had 3 days before the task force briefing. She used them the way her father had always used preparation time, quietly, thoroughly, without announcement. The briefing room for Operation Dark Ridge had no windows. Just sat at the table with Master Sergeant Tate, 38 years old, the kind of man whose age was carried entirely in his eyes rather than his face. A level, unhurried attention that registered everything and reacted to very little. Braddock was present. So was a signals officer named Caldwell, whom Jess had never met and would not see again after the mission. The target was Victor Sorokin. The name meant something in certain rooms. Not a household name, the other kind, the kind that operated below public attention, moved through gaps in international oversight, supplied people who supplied other people with things that eventually appeared as casualty reports from places where American soldiers were present. His compound sat in a valley in the Clearwater Mountains of northern Idaho, inside private property large enough to constitute its own jurisdiction, protected by topography as much as personnel. Previous approaches had not produced results. The current solution required a single shot from outside his security perimeter. Tate walked her through the terrain analysis. The compound sat at 4,300 feet accessible by one road, surrounded on 3 sides by ridgelines. The firing position was on the northeast ridge, reached by an 18-hour approach on foot, through mixed terrain timber rock and open slope above the tree line. Distance from position to the compound's primary structure, 2,950 meters. The same distance as Sierra Run. She noted this without saying anything. The atmospheric conditions in the Clearwater Mountains in late autumn were nothing like Nevada desert. Humidity higher, temperature differentials more extreme, wind patterns moving through multiple topographic layers before reaching the valley floor, the same layering effects she had learned in Montana and applied at Sierra Run, but more complex, more demanding. She had grown up in terrain like this. She understood what Tate was outlining before he finished. They would insert on foot at night, 40 hours in position, observing patterns. The window was tied to Sorokin's predictable movement to his office on the compound's 2nd floor, where intelligence indicated he conducted business calls on a regular schedule. He would be stationary, visible through the eastern window, present for approximately 10 minutes. 1 shot. Braddock looked at her before the briefing ended. She asked if there were questions she should be asking that she hadn't asked. He said the terrain was the variable they couldn't fully anticipate from satellite data. That everything in the brief was accurate as far as it went, but the mountain would add things they couldn't see from here. She said she understood. He said he knew she did. The insertion was cold and long and largely silent. She had packed for the terrain rather than the list, stripping weight from places that wouldn't matter, adding it where it would. Tate moved through the terrain with the efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions, setting a pace that respected the altitude and the hours ahead without conceding anything unnecessary to either. They didn't speak much. The mountain required attention that conversation would divide, and both of them understood this. She watched the tree line as they climbed above it, reading the wind's character as it left the timber and changed against open rock and slope. She was already building the model her head would need to hold current and accurate when the rifle was in her hands and the window was open. The firing position was a natural granite shelf partially sheltered by rock to the north with an unobstructed view southwest toward the compound. Tate had selected it correctly. They settled in. The waiting was the part that most accounts of operations like this compressed into a sentence or omitted entirely. The reality was 40 hours of cold and stillness in the kind of attention that couldn't be sustained consciously and had to be distributed across the body, hands, ears, eyes, rotating through their arcs, the mind present without grip being aware, without straining. She thought about Nash's words, the open question of her father in a record she hadn't known existed. She held it as her father had taught her to hold what she couldn't yet explain, not by resolving it, but by choosing the present moment over the unresolvable one. On the second day the intelligence update arrived, Tate took it through the earpiece, listened, looked at her once. Sorokin had changed his location within the compound, not fled, moved, now in a secondary structure on the eastern side positioned at an angle to the ridge that increased the effective distance. The new distance was 3,200 meters, 250 meters beyond Sierra Run, beyond any confirmed first-round hit in conditions of this type. And the conditions were getting worse. A weather system was moving through the valley, not a full storm, but the leading edge of one, tightening the air and changing the thermal pattern she had been reading for 40 hours. The layers were compressing, introducing variability at the altitude where her bullet would travel the longest portion of its trajectory. Tate watched her work through it. His expression didn't change. He understood his role in this moment, give her data without pressure, let her build the picture, stay out of the space between the shooter and the shot. She asked for wind readings at 3 elevations. He gave them. She mapped them against what her eyes were showing. The new pattern was readable, but the reading was less certain. The margin for error was tighter, the window narrower. She asked for a 10-minute weather update. They waited. The update came. The weather system was moving faster than predicted. The window for the shot would be approximately 4 minutes beginning in 20. She had 20 minutes to make a decision she couldn't undo. She settled behind the rifle, built the picture as completely and honestly as she could, and what it told her was that the shot was possible, not certain, not clean, but within the range of what she could execute if everything her training held in the moment it needed to hold. Through the scope, she found Sorokin. He stood at a desk looking at something she couldn't see, not moving. She breathed, found her depth, moved through the sequence. And in the last second before the trigger broke in the space between intention and execution, she had navigated thousands of times without error. Something happened that had never happened before. Her hand moved. Not much, not visibly probably. A fraction of an inch, a tremor running through the tendons of her right hand from a source she couldn't immediately name. In that fraction of an inch, the entire calculation, 3,200 meters of layered mountain air, every temperature differential, every thermal current she had been reading since before dawn, was rendered beside the point. She felt it happen. She could not stop it in time. The rifle fired. Through the scope, she watched the impact. At 3,200 meters, a puff of dust and shattered material appeared 2 feet to the left of where Sorokin had been standing. 2 feet. He was moving before the sound reached him, dropping behind the desk, heading for the interior of the structure, and every window, intelligence window, atmospheric window, every window closed simultaneously. Tate's voice was quiet. It was always quiet. He said, "Extract." She did not move for 1 full second. Then she did. The extraction took 4 hours. During the movement down off the ridge crossing a section of exposed slope and compromised visibility, one of the 2 support personnel covering their exit took a fragmentation hit from a perimeter charge, a tripwire device the sweep had missed. He went down on Jess's left, not critically injured. The wound was to the left forearm, deep enough to require treatment, not deep enough to threaten anything permanent. She was 8 feet away when it happened. She heard it, saw him go down. Watched Tate move to him, immediately cover the wound, establish pressure, the team continuing the extract, without breaking pace, because breaking pace was the worst option, and everyone present was trained to know this. She covered her arc. She moved when she was supposed to move, but she was the reason they were extracting under these conditions rather than extracting clean. Nobody said this out loud. It was simply the arithmetic of the situation available to anyone willing to add it up. Back at the forward operating location in a room with a single window, looking out on a pine-covered hillside, Jess sat alone. Tate came in after an hour. He stood near the door with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the flat assessment he used for everything, eyes carrying more years than the face around them. She told him she had moved, that she had felt it happen, that she could not fully account for it in technical terms. He said every shooter at some point found the exact thing they hadn't been trained to prepare for. Not external conditions, not technical variables, the internal one. The thing the body did when it fully understood for the first time what the hands were about to do. He had seen experienced men come apart at this moment and never reassemble. He had seen others go through it and come out different, not diminished, but changed in the specific way things changed when they had been tested and survived. He said the ones who never hesitate scare me more than the ones who do. Means they haven't understood what the work costs yet. He left. Braddock came in 20 minutes later. He stood near the window with his arms crossed looking at the hillside before he spoke. He said her father had missed a shot once, the only one in a career that people still discussed that had built the reputation she was carrying without having asked to carry it. He said, when this is over, I'll tell you about it. Outside, the pine hillside caught the last afternoon light and held it briefly. Then let it go. The investigation took 48 hours. Every element reviewed the approach route position, selection, weather data, intelligence timeline, the decision to attempt the shot at the new distance in deteriorating conditions. The findings were clear. No equipment failure, no intelligence error that could have been anticipated, no procedural breakdown. Every controllable element had been managed correctly. The shot missed because the shooter's hand moved at the moment of trigger break. The reason the hand moved was not technical. Jess submitted her own account, precise, unsparing the way her father had taught her to report what she had actually seen rather than what she wished she had seen. She didn't qualify the tremor, didn't explain it in terms of reducing her responsibility. She described it as it had occurred. Tate reviewed the report and signed it without amendment. Braddock submitted a 2-paragraph brief concluding with a single sentence Jess would not read until later when she understood its full context. The shooter's fundamental skills are not in question. The wounded support personnel was already on his feet, arm in a sling, asking about return-to-duty timelines. He held no visible grievance. He understood the nature of the work and the risks that came with it, and he carried them the way professionals carried such things, not lightly, but without drama. He and Jess crossed paths in the corridor on the second morning. He looked at her, she looked at him. Neither said anything because nothing that needed to be said was available to language in that moment. What passed between them was simpler and older than language, an acknowledgement, a mutual presence in the weight of what had happened and what it meant. She carried it. She would carry it forward. That was the only direction available. She requested the meeting with Doyle. This was not the expected move, and she knew it wasn't. She made it anyway because the expected move, waiting, maintaining distance, allowing institutional consequence to proceed without her involvement, was not going to give her what she needed for the next attempt. She needed to understand the algorithm. Not from the manual, not from Vance, who understood it from the inside with the particular blind spot of knowing too much about a system's architecture to clearly see its edges. She needed to understand it from someone who had worked against it, who had felt its failures from the position of the person depending on it. Doyle was the only person who fit that description precisely. She submitted the request through proper channels, a formal application to discuss technical aspects of the XM31 targeting system, framed in language making its purpose unmistakably professional. No personal element, no reference to Sierra Run or what had been said there, just a technical question from a shooter who needed information. He declined. She resubmitted with the same language, adding one sentence, "I am not asking about what happened between us. I am asking about the system." He didn't respond to the second request. She waited 3 days. Then she walked to the office he had been assigned during his administrative review, knocked twice, and stood in the open doorway without entering. He looked up from the papers on his desk. She said, "I missed a shot. I need to know what the system does at extreme range when the thermal layering is compressed by a frontal weather system. You know more about the algorithm's compensation behavior under those conditions than anyone else I have access to." She waited. He looked at her for a long time. Not the look from Sierra Run. That look had been a weapon deployed with purpose. This one was different, older. The look of a man who had been sitting in a room for 2 weeks with the specific company of his own recent decisions and had arrived somewhere beyond his first responses. He said, "Close the door." She did. She sat across from him, put her hands on the table, and asked her first technical question. What followed was 2 hours and 40 minutes of the most useful conversation she'd had since arriving at Fort Benning. Doyle was whatever else he was, a man who understood the system beyond operation and into design. He had served as field consultant during development, not an engineer, but the person in the room asking what happened when theory met terrain. He had spent 3 years doing this. He knew where the seams were. He answered with the precision of a man who had stopped caring what the answers said about him and was only interested in whether they were accurate. The professional pride of someone for whom accuracy was non-negotiable, even when personally costly. The atmospheric compensation algorithm, he explained, was built on a sensor averaging model. It collected data from multiple range points and combined them into a single atmospheric profile for ballistic calculation. The problem which the development team had known about and categorized as an edge case was that the averaging model assumed a relatively uniform distribution of atmospheric layers. When real conditions deviated significantly from that assumption, when layers were compressed, or the vertical temperature gradient was steep as it was during a frontal system's leading edge, the averaging produced a result that was internally consistent but physically false. The system gave you a number. The number was wrong. And because the number came from a computer rather than human judgment, there was a tendency to trust it beyond what conditions warranted. She asked when this had been identified. He looked at the table. He said 14 months ago, internal review. Classified as a performance limitation rather than a defect, flagged for future revision. She kept her voice even. She asked why it hadn't been reported upward. He kept his eyes on the table for a moment. Then he looked up. The system was in the final stages of budget authorization, he said. A reported defect at that stage would have triggered a mandatory review cycle, minimum 18-month delay, significant probability of the entire program being restructured. $300 million in development, 2 years from operational deployment. He stopped. She understood the rest without him finishing. The calculation that had been made. The thing put on one side of the scale and the thing put on the other. A decision arrived at by people who had convinced themselves the edge case was truly an edge, that operational conditions would rarely produce the specific combination of factors exposing the flaw, that the limitation was manageable. She thought about the compound in the Clearwater Mountains, the tightening air, the weather system moving faster than predicted, the way a 14-month-old decision in a conference room had expressed itself as a tremor in her right hand and 2 feet of deviation and a man with a wound in his forearm. She did not say any of this. She asked her remaining technical questions. He answered them. When she stood to leave, he said quietly without looking at her, "I heard you reported the miss without qualification." She said that was correct. He said your father would have done the same. She stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. She stood there 3 seconds with her hand on the frame. Then she walked out. The second briefing for Operation Dark Ridge was shorter than the first. The intelligence picture was unchanged in its essential structure. Sorokin remained in the compound. His movement patterns had grown more cautious, modified schedule, varied internal routes, reduced window exposure, but he had not abandoned the location. Whatever business kept him in those mountains was not yet finished. The window existed. It was narrower than before. Tate reviewed updated terrain data with her that evening. Nash sat at the far end of the table and reviewed it with them. He had requested inclusion in the second insertion. The request was approved without discussion, which told Jess something about how the chain of command had assessed the first attempt, not as a personnel failure, but as a conditions problem, warranting additional capability at the position. Nash didn't explain his request to her. He didn't need to. She understood it from what he did, rather than what he said. He had watched her miss. He had watched her report it without qualification. He was here because he had decided she was worth being beside. She told them both what she had learned from Doyle about the averaging algorithm's behavior under compressed thermal conditions. She described her intended methodology, raw sensor data combined with manual visual assessment, the averaging performed by her rather than the processor, the composite picture the machine couldn't build because it lacked the instrument that mattered most in these conditions. Nash listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Walk me through the sensor data protocol. What readings, what intervals, what cross-reference points?" She walked him through it. He asked 2 technical questions. She answered them. He nodded once, the nod of someone who has assessed a plan and found it sound without finding it simple. Tate looked at both of them. He said December in the Clearwater is going to add things the satellite data doesn't show. Nash said mountains always have opinions. The insertion began before dawn. The cold of the Clearwater Mountains in December was institutional, settled into rock and timber over months, resident in the ground itself, the kind of cold that treats the human body as a temporary inconvenience rather than a presence worthy of acknowledgement. They moved in single file through the timber, Nash on point, just behind him, Tate covering their rear. The pace was Nash's steady conserving, calibrated for the altitude and the hours ahead. He moved through difficult ground, not against it, but with it reading slope and snow depth and surface stability without breaking stride. She watched his movement and learned from it. Her father had taught her that observation was not limited to the target. You could learn the shape of a skill by watching it in the person beside you. They reached the firing position 90 minutes before first light and cleared it in silence. 6 inches of hard-packed snow on the granite shelf. They worked methodically without urgency, Tate establishing the spotting position, while Nash and Jess prepared the primary hide. When the work was done, Nash knelt at the edge of the position and looked out over the dark valley below. The compound was invisible in the darkness, but he studied the space where it would be with the attention of someone memorizing terrain they intended to know from every angle. He said quietly, not looking at her, "Your father's name came up in a briefing I attended about 8 years ago. I didn't know him, but the men in that room who did spoke about him in a specific way, like he was a fixed point, something you could navigate by." She didn't respond immediately. The dark valley held a northwest wind off the far ridge, and she was already reading it, already feeling the layered character of the air that would be the central variable of the next 40 hours. She said he would have been uncomfortable hearing that. Nash said, "I know. That's part of why they meant it." He moved back to his position, and the waiting began. The 40 hours passed in the rhythm of sustained attention that erases ordinary time and replaces it with something more granular and more honest. Cold, stillness, the compound coming alive below them with the day's business and going quiet with the nights. Tate tracking movement, Nash watching the northern approach, monitoring security patterns. Jess building and rebuilding the atmospheric picture as the weather system that moved in on the second day settled overhead like something with intentions. The layering was there as she had anticipated. Different from Sierra Run, denser, more compressed by the ridge topography, moving in the 3-part oscillation she had cataloged from satellite data and was now reading directly. Complex, not chaotic. Complex meant readable if you had the patience and the right instrument. She had both. The intelligence update came at 13:40 on the second day. Sorokin was moving to his secondary office. The window would open in approximately 25 minutes. The atmospheric system overhead had passed its worst phase. What remained was consistent winter, rather than frontal instability. Cold and steady, the conditions that made difficult shots. Merely difficult, rather than theoretically impossible. Tate confirmed the distance, 3,200 meters. Nash moved to the secondary spotting position on her right, giving her a second set of eyes on the valley floor, a backup read on the wind indicators below. He said nothing. He was simply there doing his part of the work the way he did everything, without announcement, without performing competence. Just competence made visible through action. She began building the final picture. The raw sensor readings came through Tate's equipment. She took each number and held it against what her eyes were showing: the movement of the near-slope timber, the behavior of snow crystals at the shelf's edge, the subtle oscillation in the air above the valley floor that was invisible to instruments and completely legible to someone who had learned over 15 years and 10,000 hours to read it. The composite picture assembled the way honest pictures always assembled, not in a flash of insight, but in the slow convergence of multiple true sources, each piece confirming or adjusting the others, until the whole was more accurate than any single part could be. She had the picture. Tate said, "He's at the window, still." Nash said quietly from her right, northwest wind cycling, "You have approximately 8 seconds at the bottom of the cycle." She had already seen it. She found the breath, let half of it go. This time in the space before the trigger broke, in the place where the tremor had lived during the first attempt, there was something different. Not absence, not the suppression of something that wanted to be there. The weight was present. She felt it fully, the complete reality of what the shot meant and what it wanted and what it would cost, and she was carrying it with both hands as she had been carrying it since the corridor at the forward operating location and the man with the wound in his forearm, and the arithmetic of what she had and hadn't done. The cost was real. She was not pretending otherwise. She was simply doing what her father had done, holding the weight and doing the work anyway, because the alternative was not doing the work, and that was a different kind of cost entirely. She squeezed. 3,200 meters of Idaho mountain air. Tate watched through the spotting scope. 1 second, 2, 3. He said, "Center mass. Target is down." Nash exhaled beside her, a controlled professional sound. Then without inflection, "Good shot." From Tate's radio 40 seconds later came formal confirmation. Victor Sorokin deceased, mission complete. She safed the weapon. Her hands were steady. Nash was already breaking down his equipment with the same economy she had watched at Fort Benning's long-range bay. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. He glanced at her once briefly with the expression she had come to recognize. Not warm in any demonstrative sense. Something more durable than warmth, a form of acknowledgement that didn't require words and didn't expire when circumstances changed. Tate said 20 minutes. Let's move. They moved. The extraction was clean. 4 hours through snow and timber in the indifferent cold of a mountain that held no opinion about what had occurred on its northeast ridge that would be here in the same configuration next December, and the one after that carrying its weather and its geography forward with the patience of things that outlast the events unfolding within them. The debrief took a day and a half. The findings were reported up the chain with the efficiency attaching to successes following failures. Jess wrote her account with the same precision she had brought to her account of the missed conditions methodology, the shot, and what was different about this attempt. In describing what was different, she described something she hadn't fully articulated even to herself until she was writing it. The difference was not technical. The difference was that she had carried the cost of the work fully and consciously and done it anyway, and that the carrying was its own form of preparation, one that couldn't be done in advance but had to be done inside the moment. She submitted the account. The formal findings regarding Doyle's disclosure about the algorithm's known limitation were processed through a separate channel. He was not discharged. He was reassigned to the System Evaluation Division, where his knowledge of the XM31's architecture made him, with a dark institutional irony, that Braddock noted privately, the most qualified person to lead the review that his 14 months of silence had prevented. The XM31 program was suspended pending redesign of the atmospheric compensation module. 18 months minimum. Doyle wrote a full technical disclosure. Every limitation, every workaround, every compromise made in the name of schedule and budget. He wrote it in the flat, precise language of engineering documentation. And if there was anything in it beyond technical accuracy, any acknowledgement of what the gap between known limitation and disclosure had cost, it existed in the white space in a document written by a man who had decided finally that accuracy was the only form of integrity available to him at this stage. General Harwick signed the transfer orders on a Friday afternoon. Jess received them in a manila envelope delivered through standard channels, the way things worked in this world and the way they should. The orders assigned her to the Advanced Skills Preservation Program, whose mandate was documenting and standardizing technical competencies that existed only in practitioners and had no written form competencies that would disappear when the practitioners did, if nothing was done to capture them. Her specific assignment, long-range atmospheric reading, the skill her father had given her on Montana mornings before the machines had tried to replace it and discovered they couldn't. She read the orders twice. Then she looked up at Braddock, who was sitting across from her in the windowless room where the operation had first been briefed. The symmetry of it felt either accidental or deliberate, and it didn't matter which. He said, "I promised you a story." She said, "I remember." He folded his hands on the table and began. Her father had missed a shot once. This was known at the edges of the community that knew Cal Calloway's name, a single miss in a career producing nothing else to note except achievement. A reconnaissance operation, extended position, deteriorating conditions. A window open well beyond its planned duration. The miss was documented. Cal Calloway had put it in the record himself in full without qualification. Braddock paused. She waited. He said what most people who know the name don't know is what the report contained beyond the acknowledgement of the miss. Her father, he said, had identified the reason. Not external conditions, those were noted but not cited as cause. The reason he identified was a flaw in the standard pre-shot assessment protocol for extended duration positions. After 20 or more hours in a fixed position, a shooter's win reference point shifted in ways the existing protocol didn't account for. The protocol had been designed for positions of 12 hours or less. Extended positions created a perceptual recalibration, introducing systematic error into the assessment. Cal had experienced it, recognized it precisely for what it was, and documented it fully. He proposed a specific modification. He submitted the report under his own name, Braddock said. Didn't distribute the responsibility. Didn't frame it in language that would reduce what it said about him. He wrote what happened, why it happened, and what needed to change. Braddock was quiet. The modification was implemented 6 months later, he said. Standard protocol across reconnaissance and long-range precision units. Not announced, not publicized. Just incorporated quietly the way useful things got built into systems when the people responsible did their jobs honestly. 18 months after the protocol change, a reconnaissance team was running an extended position operation in elevated terrain. At hour 22, the spotter ran the modified assessment procedure and identified a wind recalibration error that would have deflected the shot by a margin compromising the entire operation at a critical moment. He looked at her directly. The modified protocol gave them the correct data. They adjusted. The shot was clean. The team extracted without incident. He said Nash was on that team. The room was very quiet. She understood now what Nash had been doing since she arrived at Fort Benning. The measured distance, the willingness to train her without warmth, none of it had been about her at first. It had been about whether she was the kind of person her father was, whether she would do what Cal Calloway had done when the hard thing arrived report. It honestly carry it without deflection. Let the record show what the record should show. She had missed a shot in the Clearwater Mountains. She had written a report saying so fully without qualification. Nash had read it. The question he had been asking since she walked onto the long-range bay at Fort Benning had been answered not by the second shot, but by the report after the first one. She sat with all of this. Braddock waited. He was good at it. She said, "He never told me any of it." Braddock said no, he wouldn't have. She said, "Why not?" He considered this carefully. Then he said, "Because he wasn't doing it for the record. He was doing it because it was the right thing." Men who do the right thing because it's the right thing generally don't explain it. They do it and move on to the next thing that needs doing. He pushed the manila envelope across the table to her. She looked at the orders inside. Then she looked up. He said the XM31 program is suspended 18 months. Doyle is leading the review, which is either justice or irony, probably both. And somewhere in an old protocol document, your father's name sits in the revision history. Not famous, not displayed, just there doing its work the way he did his. He stood, extended his hand across the table. She took it. He said, "Your father built something that outlasted him and saved people he never met. There's no better definition of a life well spent that I've come across." She said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. Nash was at the outdoor range when she found him. December afternoon, flat white sky pressing down on the pine hills surrounding Fort Benning, the cold, steady, and committed. He was working a practice series at 800 meters, the same distance, the same patient rhythm she had watched from 50 feet back on the day she arrived. She stood at the same distance and watched him finish the same way she had watched him then. He safed the weapon and sat up. He looked at her. She said, "Braddock told me about the protocol, about your team." He stood, brushed snow from his jacket. He didn't speak immediately. He was a man who took time with things that mattered. He said, "I've known for years that a change in protocol kept my team alive on a long operation. Took me a while to trace where the change came from. The paper trail was old, and the man who initiated it wasn't the type to leave his name somewhere visible." He looked at her. He said, "When I found it, I started paying attention to the name. And when you walked onto this range, I thought about what it would mean if you were what the name suggested, whether someone carrying that name also carried what came with it." She said the report about the miss. He said any shooter can perform under good conditions. What your father did, what you did, takes something that can't be trained into a person if it isn't already there. The willingness to put the true thing in the record when the true thing costs you. He extended his hand. She took it. His grip was what it had always been, direct. No performance, the handshake of a man for whom the gesture was the substance. He said your dad would have hated the paperwork. She laughed. It came from somewhere she hadn't expected, genuine and brief and unguarded. Nash's expression changed, not quite a smile, but what lived beside one, reaching all the way to his eyes. She said he would have complained about every line of it and submitted it exactly on time. Nash said, "Sounds right." They stood at the outdoor range in the December cold, two shooters who had arrived at a shared place from entirely different directions, and the shared place had the quality of things earned rather than given. Solid underfoot, requiring no explanation. He said the fundamentals course gets a new cohort in January. Word is you'll be working with them on atmospheric reading before they transfer to advanced programs. She said they won't like the early mornings. He said they never do. She said the ones worth keeping will figure out why eventually. He said yes, they will. She was crossing the compound toward the gate when she saw the young woman. Standing at the equipment check-in with a kit bag at her feet, oriented to a new geography with the careful attention of someone who doesn't yet know which details will matter and is trying to register all of them. She was looking at her own hands, turning them over once in a private, unaddressed way that Jess recognized without being able to name precisely. The presence of a thing you want to do and the space between that wanting and the knowing of whether you can. Jess stopped. The young woman looked up. Straightened, not quite attention, not quite casual. Private's insignia, 19 or 20. She said her name was Dana Whitmore. Said she had arrived for the fundamentals assessment. Said she had read about Sierra Run the distance, the disabled targeting system, the first round hit, and that reading it had done something unexpected. It had made her believe that a thing she had been told was exceptional might actually be something a person could learn if they were willing to do what learning required. She paused, then said, "My father was in the Marines, recon. He never talked much about what he did overseas. But there was one story he told once. He said his team had come home from a long operation because someone they didn't know had done something quietly without asking for anything back that kept them alive. He said this man had the chance to bury a mistake and chose instead to put it in the record. He said that was the only kind of person worth learning from. Not the ones who never made mistakes. The ones honest about the ones they did." She looked at Jess steadily. She said, "I always thought I'd want to know who that person was. But maybe it's enough to know people like that exist." Jess was still. The chain ran further than she had known. Cal Calloway in a field somewhere, writing a report that didn't have to say what it said, costing him something to say it. A protocol change saving a team. A man on that team who came home and had a daughter who was now standing at a check-in desk at Fort Benning with something in her hands she didn't yet know the name of. The compound around them held its ordinary sounds boots on pavement equipment being moved, a door closing somewhere. The December light lay flat and even across the grounds, showing things as they were rather than as they might be. Unglamorous and clear. Jess said the fundamentals course is harder than it sounds. Dana Whitmore said she expected that. Jess said the technical parts are learnable. Most people who don't make it don't fail the technical parts. She waited. Jess said the hard part is learning to hold what you can't yet explain, to sit with the unresolved thing and keep working instead of filling the gap with something comfortable. Your father told you one true thing about the kind of person worth becoming. The rest you're going to have to find yourself. But one true thing is the right place to start. Dana Whitmore took this in the way someone receives something they didn't fully understand, but recognized as worth keeping. Jess picked up her bag from beside the gate. She said morning formations are at 0500. Don't be late. Dana Whitmore said, "Yes, ma'am." Jess walked through the gate. Behind her, the compound continued its work formations, running equipment, moving the ordinary machinery of an institution that trained people for things that could not be fully trained for, that sent them out into conditions exceeding what any controlled environment could prepare them for, and asked them to do the work anyway. In an engineering archive, a suspended program's full technical disclosure sat in a file under Doyle's name, every limitation, every compromise, every edge case that had been called manageable and had turned out not to be. Doyle was at his desk 2 buildings over, beginning the first day of a review that would take 18 months and produce something more honest than what he had built the first time, because he was being required to do the one thing he had avoided for 14 months, which was tell the complete truth about what he knew and when he knew it. In northern Idaho, a valley held winter, and the memory of a morning when the air had been read correctly and a man who had done a great deal of harm had been stopped from doing more. The mountain held no record of it, carried no opinion about it. It would be there next December, in the same configuration, patient with the weather and the events occurring within its terrain the way mountains were patient with everything. In a protocol document in a military archive, a name sat in the revision history, not framed, not displayed. There because it belonged there, doing the work it had always done quietly, permanently, in the way useful things persisted when the people who built them were gone. Jess Calloway walked across the parking lot toward her vehicle in the flat December light, manila envelope under one arm, the Clearwater Mountains still in her muscle memory, the weight of the rifle, the temperature of the granite 3,200 meters of layered air that had for one morning yielded its truth to a person willing to read it honestly. The wind was from the northwest. She felt it against her face. Read it without deciding, to the way you breathed, the way your heart moved blood through chambers without instruction, the body performing what had been practiced until practice and person were no longer separable, until the line between the training and the trained had dissolved into something that simply was. Her father had shown her what to look for. She had been looking ever since. She would keep looking. The gate closed behind her. The pine hills above Fort Benning received the last of the afternoon light and held it for a moment the way things held what was given to them before the dark came, and then released it as everything that receives light eventually does into the long, patient settling of a December evening in Georgia. Somewhere in the mountains of Montana, snow was falling on a granite shelf above a valley where a man had once sat without speaking beside a 9-year-old girl and let the light come on its own because he understood that the most important things couldn't be told and could only be shown, and that showing them required patience, and that patience was not the absence of urgency, but the presence of something larger than urgency, something that knew the light was coming and was content to wait for it. She got in her vehicle, started the engine, and drove toward whatever the work required next.